Imagine waking up one day and your life savings can barely buy a cup of coffee. That's not a nightmare. That's reality for millions of people in Venezuela right now. And here's the crazy part. Venezuela has more oil than any country on earth. More than Saudi Arabia. More than Russia. More than anyone. So how does the country with the world's largest oil reserves become one of the poorest nations on the planet? This story isn't just about Venezuela. It's about what happens when an economy goes from hero to zero, and why every single one of us needs to understand these lessons about wealth, debt, and economic survival. Let's go back to the 1950s. Venezuela was the fourth richest country in the entire world. Their GDP per capita was 12 times higher than that of China. People were flooding into Venezuela looking for opportunity. Caracas had gleaming skyscrapers. Shopping malls were packed with luxury goods. The middle class was booming. Families could afford cars, vacations, and save for retirement. Venezuelan currency was actually worth something. This wasn't luck. It was oil. Beneath Venezuela's soil sits 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's 17% of the entire world's oil. At today's prices, that's over $17 trillion worth of black gold. But here's where the story takes a turn. When you have that much wealth concentrated in one resource, it creates what economists call the resource curse. Instead of building a diversified economy, Venezuela became addicted to oil money. And like any addiction, it seemed great until it didn't. By the 1970s, Venezuela was still riding high. They had the highest per capita income in Latin America. Oil money was everywhere, but underneath, cracks were forming. The country wasn't investing in manufacturing. They weren't building tech industries. They weren't creating multiple income streams. They put all their eggs in one basket, and that basket was filled with oil. Then, in 1999, Hugo Chavez took power. He promised to use oil wealth to eliminate poverty and create equality. On paper, it sounded amazing. Free healthcare, free education, subsidized food and housing. He called it 21st century socialism. And at first, when oil prices were high, the money flowed. Poverty rates dropped. People felt hopeful. But Chavez made three catastrophic decisions that would eventually destroy the Venezuelan economy. Decision number one, price controls. The government decided they would control the prices of basic goods. Bread, milk, toilet paper, medicine. The idea was to make things affordable for everyone. Sounds good, right? Wrong. When you force businesses to sell products below the cost of production, they stop producing. Why would a bakery bake bread if they lose money on every loaf? Factories shut down. Store shelves went empty. People started waiting in lines for hours just to buy basic necessities. And when products did appear, people hoarded them because they didn't know when they'd be available again. The black market exploded. Price controls created the exact opposite of what they promised: massive shortages. Decision number two, nationalization. Chavez took over private companies and industries. Oil companies, telecommunications, electricity, steel, banking, agriculture. Over 1,000 companies were seized by the government. The theory was that government control would serve the people better than profit-driven corporations. But here's what actually happened. The government put political allies in charge instead of qualified managers. Productivity collapsed. Oil production, Venezuela's cash cow, started plummeting. In 2000, Venezuela produced 3.2 million barrels per day. By 2020, it was down to 500,000 barrels. That's an 85% drop. The oil infrastructure crumbled from neglect and incompetence. Foreign companies pulled out because their assets were seized without fair compensation. Investment dried up. Decision number three, printing money. When oil prices crashed in 2014, Venezuela had a problem. They'd been spending money they didn't have. So what did they do? They fired up the printing presses. They created money out of thin air to pay their bills and fund their programs. This is where hyperinflation enters the picture. In 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate hit 130,000%. Let me put that in perspective. If you had $100 in January, by December it would be worth about 8 cents. Your savings evaporated. Your paycheck became worthless before you could spend it. A simple cup of coffee cost millions of bolivars. Workers got paid and immediately ran to spend it because their money was losing value by the hour. The results were devastating. Today, 82% of Venezuelans live in poverty. More than half live in extreme poverty, which means they can't even afford basic food. The average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds because food is so scarce. Over 7.9 million people, more than 25% of the population, have fled the country since 2014. This is one of the largest displacement crises in world history. Families are torn apart, children are left behind. People risk their lives walking thousands of miles to escape. Meanwhile, the healthcare system collapsed. Hospitals have no medicine, no electricity, no running water. Doctors fled the country. Diseases that were eliminated decades ago are coming back. Crime exploded because desperate people do desperate things. So what are the lessons here for your own financial life? First, diversification isn't just smart, it's survival. Venezuela bet everything on oil. When oil prices fell, they had nothing to fall back on. Your income needs multiple streams. Your investments need to be spread across different assets. Never put all your eggs in one basket, no matter how good that basket looks. Second, understand that printing money destroys wealth. When governments create money out of thin air, your purchasing power evaporates. This is why hard assets and financial education matter. You need to understand inflation and protect yourself against it. Third, price controls and government interventions sound good but create disaster. When markets can't function freely, shortages happen. Businesses fail. Innovation stops. The road to economic hell is paved with good intentions. Venezuela's economy is a warning for the entire world. It shows us how quickly prosperity can turn into poverty when you ignore basic economic principles. It shows us what happens when you sacrifice long-term stability for short-term political promises. It shows us that natural resources alone don't create wealth. Smart management, diversification, and sound economic policies create wealth. The country with the world's largest oil reserves can't even keep the lights on. That should terrify anyone who cares about their financial future. Right now, Venezuela is trying to rebuild. There are some signs of modest growth. In 2023, the economy grew by 5%, but they're starting from rock bottom. Their GDP is still 75% lower than it was in 2013. The currency is still unstable. Poverty is still rampant. It will take decades to recover from this economic catastrophe if they ever fully do. The damage runs deep, not just economically, but socially and psychologically. Here's what you need to take away from Venezuela's story. Wealth isn't permanent. Economic stability isn't guaranteed. The decisions leaders make have massive consequences for ordinary people. Your financial education is your best defense against economic chaos. Understand inflation, understand diversification, understand the difference between real wealth and paper wealth. Don't rely on a single income source. Don't assume your government will always make smart decisions. Don't think that just because things are good now, they'll always be good. Venezuela had everything going for them: natural resources, educated population, and strategic location. But they lost it all through bad economic policies. This can happen anywhere. It can happen to any country. It can happen to any individual who doesn't understand these principles. Your money is your responsibility. Your financial future is in your hands. Learn from Venezuela's mistakes. Build multiple income streams. Invest wisely. Understand economics. Protect your wealth. Because if it can happen to the fourth richest country in the world, it can happen to anyone. Don't let that be you.